Hi, welcome everyone. Graciously, Catherine Van Boskirk has offered to talk to us a little bit today about resilience and the things that we can do during this time of shelter in place and the coronavirus. Catherine is a licensed clinical social worker and has done many years of suicide intervention and work on growth and wellness, and has some key things that could serve us during this time. So thank you so much for coming, and please, we're
Thank you.
anxious to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Cindy. You know, I spent all of last year working very hard on developing a one-day training in radical resilience. And I did this in collaboration with a wonderful researcher named Alice Updike Scannell. And it was a wonderful collaboration because we built off of each other, and she gave me permission to use her research, which identified 10 skills for radical resilience. Let me first start off and say, we all have capacity for resilience, and that even all of the researchers agree on. And they also agree on one other thing. They agree that we can practice it and get better. So if we all have some, we're not starting from zero. And I liked the term radical resilience because when I was studying 2 years ago about what resilience was, it had always definition like you can bounce back. And, sometimes in my life, things have happened that I have not been able to bounce back from. One of them at this moment is coronavirus. I mean, it's going on. I prefer to say physical distancing than social distancing. I've been physical distancing for the last month here in Arizona. And, I'm not bouncing. And there are other things that have happened in my life that I don't bounce from. Now, maybe I would have said before, and I've said this in my one-day training, maybe we bounce back from the flu. Well, I have to change that because, some people don't bounce back from the flu. I was thinking more the kind you get a 24-hour virus or something and you feel terrible, you throw up, and then you're all better. That's more like bouncing back. But I think that there are many adversities and trauma in our lives that we just don't bounce back. And in some ways, it's a disservice to define resilience as bouncing back. I mean, it comes from an engineering term. Those bumper things on cars that now, if you bump something, it sort of goes in and it bounces back. Well, that's not really useful, I think, when we're in something like this kind of shutdown. And so radical resilience is when the kind of resilience you need to use when things just keep having difficulties and the adversity or loss that you've experienced is going on for some time. And I think we, with good self-compassion, need to say, okay, I'm not bouncing back from this. And who could? So we need to do something to develop practical skills that help us, what I call, steer through when we've had something difficult happen, or when we are having something difficult happen, like we are now. Nobody in our lifetime has experienced anything like this kind of what they're calling social isolation. And I heard somebody call it incubation instead of social isolation, which I think is a good example of reframing, which is one of the skills. Before I touch on a couple of the skills, let me say something about, there are certain conditions, certain framework within which radical resilience needs to happen. And I'll just mention two. One is self-awareness. Now, That's not always fun. And what I mean by self-awareness is kind of an awareness, not just about how we're feeling, although that's really powerful. It's also an awareness about our attitudes, how we communicate, how we deal with loss, how we deal when we're confronted with somebody who's angry, and how we deal with, all kinds of disappointments. So it's the big requirement to be self-aware. Does that all make sense to you, Cindy?
I think it does, and since I've had the opportunity to be in your one-day workshop before about resilience, I've found myself trying to remember all of the things that we learned during that so that I could make use of them now. So I think the idea of not bouncing but steering when we have this time of sort of an undefined period of uncertainty, which is different than other kinds of events that can happen. I think that it could really be helpful to people, because I've been trying to draw on it myself with more or less success, depending on which day I'm not bouncing on. So I think that that's really helpful.
Well, then let me say something about the skills that, frankly, I have been practicing. And I'm going to start out with courage. We don't also often think of courage as a skill, but the reason why I think that Alice found that in her research is that it's not just that you feel brave and you feel like you can conquer everything. It's, in fact, it's mostly not that. Courage, I'm going to say something about what Brene Brown has said. She says that there are 4 pillars of courage. The first pillar may shock you. You have to have the capacity for vulnerability. You have to feel it. You have to show it to others. So having the capacity and actually doing it aren't always the same. So you have to be willing to be vulnerable. Secondly, you have to clarify your values, because when things are important to us and we know they're important to us, we muster up our courage to deal with it. The third pillar, of course it's 4 pillars, right? Because that would hold up a ceiling. The third pillar is trust. Now, that's a tricky one because we have to know what we trust or find it out. That's part of self-awareness. And trusting in those we love, trusting in a higher power, trusting in nature, trusting in our ability to recover from health, trusting in our past experience. I'm not going to say what to trust, but we need to know what we trust. And then finally, the 4th pillar is rising skills. And I love, I don't know if any of you have heard Brene Brown speak or read her books, but she's a down-home gal who says it like it is. And her idea of rising skills means we don't have to be infinitely skilled. We don't have to have all the skills we need. We just have to practice some. We just have to work on the ones that we need to grow, and that's good enough. So I'll admit with great vulnerability that I have been practicing on my courage this entire month. And there are other skills that I've been practicing, but I think courage is often paired with persistence. And you can have courage a little bit, but if you have courage and persistence, then you keep applying, you reapply courage as necessary. You apply it not just once when the event, whatever the event or adversity happens that you experience, but you keep on keeping on. So there is a reference you can check about the importance of persistence, and I'll get back to you on that, or we'll post it. It's a wonderful research called GRIT, a book called Grit, and for the moment, the person who wrote it is escaping me. The second skill that has been really important during this month is mindfulness. Now, Alice would say that mindfulness is the gateway to all of the other skills. And maybe you'll have a sense of that in a minute if I say a little bit more. Many people attribute the idea of mindfulness to meditation only. And meditation is great. I have a ritual every morning where I do that for at least 20 minutes. And it starts my day off right. But mindfulness, that's one of the formal parts of mindfulness, meditation. You may have heard Lisa Dion's presentation also on the web, and she talks about breathing and how breathing can help us regulate ourselves. I would say it in a different way. My way of saying it is, how do I calm myself down and comfort myself? Those are the words I use. And meditation is one of those ways, and breathing exercises is another. We do have a chance to practice all those in the day training that we do together. But mindfulness is also being aware of what I'm feeling in this moment, being aware of what's going on, being aware of where my feet are, being aware of what my body feels, being aware of where my eyes are going and what I see in the room. If we name 5 things we see, and if we name 5 feelings we're having, it can immediately bring us into our body and mindfulness. Now, mindfulness, so that's something we can do in the moment. Mindfulness is always being mindful about the rest of our lives, our finances. People are struggling with this sense of, how am I going to make this without my normal income? And, that mindfulness about, okay, I'm okay today. I'm okay this week. I mean, I'm even okay for a month. And things change, as we know. It's the only constant. So being mindful about my okayness today is really critical, and not jumping ahead 6 months, a year. And I think that level of mindfulness is really important. Now, of course, you probably think already that mindfulness is, compared to self-awareness. They're partners, and they are. But let's see. Oh, another skill. There are 10 skills, but don't worry, I'm not going to deal with all 10 today. Another skill is creativity. And I call that the engine of resilience. Now, why do I call that the engine? Because often when I'm not feeling resilient, I'm tired. I don't want to get out of bed. I don't want to move. I want to cuddle under the blankets. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that creativity provides energy when we act on it. Now, it doesn't mean you have to go do an oil painting tomorrow. Doesn't mean you need to suddenly learn how to draw. When you're steering through adversity, it's not the time to demand a lot of ourselves. I think of creativity, well, I love poetry. So reading poetry is one way that I'm creative. Listening to music, playing music. My piano, I keep in pretty good tune, so that's important. The other thing that may not be good for my belly, but I've been baking. And I just made some wonderful anti-inflammatory muffins this morning and had one. And I noticed that I felt better when I finished the muffins because it was an outcome. It didn't take very much. I happened to have all the ingredients, so I didn't get stressed. And now I can share with other people who are at least open to sharing food at this time. So creativity takes a certain amount of creativeness to discover, if you don't already know, what yours is. There's a fourth skill. Well, I guess we're up to 5, aren't we? And I will label it spirituality, but I don't want to say that it has to be a certain way. Spirituality, in my mind, is meaning making. So whatever happens in your life that gives you the chance to make meaning out of your life, how things happen. It might be a higher power. It might be taking meaning in nature. It might be really taking meaning in being of service to others. As a trainer, that has given my life great meaning. There's also 2 parts that I want to add to spirituality that may not be evident. One is gratitude. Research is clear that gratitude is healthy for us, and it shifts our thinking, it shifts our feelings, and it shifts our perspective immediately. So it's related to another skill called reframing. You therapists and clinicians out there are very familiar with reframing. I thought I was really great at reframing until I tried to reframe things that happened in my life. And I learned I had to practice it a whole lot more than I was doing before. So gratitude, when you find yourself fearful, when you find yourself stressed, we need to figure out what our thoughts are telling us, because our thoughts can wreak havoc. They tell all kinds of stories. And those stories are often not helpful when the mind is totally in control of telling stories. Like, what could we tell ourselves now? This isolation period will never end. I'm going to get sick. I'll catch this dreaded virus and end up in the hospital. Oh my gosh, ending up in the hospital? You can't even see your loved ones when you're in the hospital. Well, obviously that story isn't working. And so I need to shift away from those fears and that story, the mind in control, to my heart, having more in charge. The heart has brain cells, they've discovered recently. And so the heart in its own brain will absolutely help you identify what you're grateful for. And suddenly, when you are grateful for something, you are not fearful. It's just impossible to do the 2 at the same time. The second part about spirituality that I want to name, and I don't think is typically talked about, and it has to do with self-compassion. Dr. Kristin Neff wrote a book solely on self-compassion. And initially I thought, what is she going to have to say about self-compassion? It's going to take a whole book. Well, she's a great researcher. Now that one thing I'm grateful for during this time of social incubation and physical distancing is that there are a heck of a lot of videos that you can see of people that you value and have good things to say. So Kristin Neff did a video on self-compassion on her book. It was nice to see her after I'd read the book. Self-compassion is key because I don't know about you, but the stories I tell myself about myself are always more harsh than others. And I've needed to practice self-compassion. And the first tenet of self-compassion is to never say anything to yourself in your mind that you wouldn't say to your dearest best friend. Well, there's a practice for you. That would be very helpful in this time, because maybe it's a day that, I'm tired and I don't feel like being creative, and I need to say, that's okay. Catherine, this is you steering through. And when we steer through, we have to find the channel that can help us continue to have persistence and perseverance. So those are the key skills that I've been practicing. I don't know, Cindy, is there anything else that would be helpful?
Well, I think these are really helpful. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the days I've felt more like I was doing a good job steering through, and which things I was practicing those days versus the other days. And I think that this time of complete uncertainty, and I think that's the challenge for me with persistence, is that it's not just persisting in a state of something, it is persistence in a time when uncertainty is rampant, that the story changes hourly sometimes and daily, and how to kind of gauge those things and really protect my own my own way of steering through that day and being nice to myself when I don't feel creative. So I do think that if people can take even one or two things from what you've had to offer, that makes any of the days feel better, because we have some unknown number of days we're still going to be steering through right now until there's something a little more solid underneath us as far as how things are going to turn out. And so I think it's going to be an ongoing challenge for us to figure out ways to take care of ourselves and to be kind to ourselves while we're doing it. And being grateful. I think there are lots of ways that people are working to reframe things to be grateful for right now. And I think that really helps, because it does take, for me, and I think for others, takes us out of that place of, oh my gosh, what will things look like in 6 months? When in fact, absolutely no one has any idea what it will look like in 6 months. So trying to create a story is really just an exercise in fear and frustration and futility, frankly, at this point, to try to get that far ahead of ourselves. So I think those are all really great lessons. If people could take one thing, if they only remember one thing, because people are kind of information saturated right now, if they could take one thing from these things that you've offered to us, what would be the thing that would help them, the best place to start, do you think?
That's a great question. I think that something I didn't say, but it's a condition of really practicing radical resistance, and that's supportive relationships. And it's easier to practice these skills when we are in touch with people who are supportive. Now, I know that in this social distancing time, which I call physical distancing, because I refuse to distance myself socially from people who are important to me, that it's really key to get out of our own heads and to talk to somebody who we care about and who cares about us. Now, the last part's really important. We don't want to talk about people who are really downers in this time. We want to pick somebody to stay connected to, who helps us see our own stories that aren't helpful to us. And supportive relationships will do that.
That's great. And actually, you may have coined a new phrase also for yourself while you did this, because this time you said radical resistance.
Did I?
But how I heard that was, there is radical resilience, which we're practicing, but we're also practicing in some ways radical resistance about the things that are not helpful, is
That's
how
right.
I heard it when you said. So it is a good pairing, because steering through requires both things: resilience towards things that are positive and resistance towards things that are not very helpful. And so
That's
maybe
true.
it was or was not a Freudian slip, but it felt like it really matched what you were talking about in a way that made sense to me.
That's good, because I find what I'm resisting most is what my stories tell myself in my head that aren't helpful. That's the thing to resist.
Absolutely. And I would say hands down for me, that would be my most radical resistance needed skill also is whatever stories I'm creating. So I think those are great things. And hopefully people will find something in here that will be supportive of them in navigating this journey, and we'll have a chance to talk again at some point. So thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for offering your time.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.